Cannon to the left of them, cannon to the right of them. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Yes, those words were written about the last time Western European troops were in Ukraine, Crimea to be precise. In the Crimean War, we saw a coalition of Turkish, French and British troops fight the Russians. But we're 150 years on from that now, and could we begin to see something similar? Well, what are the terms for peace, and just how many European groups might be on the ground in Ukraine? My name's Tom Harwood, and this is GBN Originals. Now, there have been a series of summits, both in the United Kingdom and the United States, in the course of the last 7 days. First, it was Emmanuel Macron's turn to visit Donald Trump in the White House last Monday. That was a meeting that seemed to go well by all accounts, although perhaps surpassed by the diplomacy of Keir Starmer when he visited a few days later. He, of course, handed an invitation to Donald Trump, written personally by the King, for an unprecedented second state visit. But it wasn't just in the actions, it was also in the words that Keir Starmer was so ably to navigate what was prepped to be a tricky meeting. He knew exactly how to deal with Donald Trump, and how to deal with Donald Trump, frankly, is flattery. Saying all the right things, thanking Donald Trump for bringing about the conditions for peace in Ukraine, talking up Donald Trump in all sorts of different ways to the point of obsequiousness. But there was where things started to get difficult, because the next day was the turn of President Zelensky. And we all know how that went, because to some extent what we saw in the Oval Office with the extraordinary row that developed and broke out and upended the chance of a minerals deal, at least in the short term, between the United States and Ukraine, well, could that have all have been avoided had President Zelensky taken a leaf out of Keir Starmer's book, bit his tongue, and been, frankly, grovelling in front of Trump and Vance? It seems that that is the way to conduct international affairs and diplomacy in the Trump age. It's clear why President Zelensky didn't want to do that, wanted to appear as a stronger leader, but could things have gone so much differently had he perhaps thrown away any sense of pride and decorum? It's a sad situation when that is really what's on the discussion there, but it's a question worth asking. So we fast forward to the very next day when President Zelensky flies to London. He meets Keir Starmer in Downing Street. He has a private audience with King Charles. And this is all ahead of a summit of 19 countries, from Canada to Germany, from Britain to the NATO head Mark Rutte as well, all sitting around a table in Lancaster House. Yes, because it was from the White House to Lancaster House in London where the gravity seemed to move this weekend. But what did these world leaders, what did all of these different leaders of these 19 different countries and organisations really agree upon?
Using the internet without a VPN, a virtual private network, is a bit like taking to the road without car insurance. All it takes is one unlucky moment to cost you a lot of cash. This video's sponsor is Private Internet Access. They are the VPN to help keep you safe. Click the link in the description below to find out why over 30 million people have downloaded PIA to protect themselves online. A virtual private network is an app that hides your IP address and helps keep your data private. When you're browsing the internet at home, you give up a large amount of data to businesses, to shops, and indeed to social media giants too. Hackers have the ability to steal your personal data with ease, including sensitive information such as passwords, keystrokes, and even your personal photos. Private Internet Access helps protect your personal data by encrypting your internet connection to keep your data out of the hands of cyber criminals. And it's not just hackers either to be concerned about. Information can be censored too. When Canada passed their C-18 bill, social media giants decided to ban news content on their platforms. But PIA can protect your ability to consume the news and content you love. Private internet access is available for Windows users, Mac OS, Android, Linux, iOS, and you can use one PIA subscription to protect an unlimited amount of devices. And we've got a huge GB News discount for you too. Click the link in this video's description and you'll get a massive 83% off PIA. That's under £2 a month, the price of a coffee, and you'll get an extra 4 months completely free on top. Also, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee too. Visit piavpn.com/GB News to start protecting yourself digitally today.
It seems that there is not yet unanimity, even from the Europeans. Unanimity of purpose, perhaps, but not of detail. The French put forward a proposal that would see a 1-month ceasefire, but that, of course, time-limited ceasefire, we don't know what would happen beyond that. The British government say that's not British policy. Is this a split between the British and the French on this issue? For the British part, they've always said they wanted to see a sustainable ceasefire, a lasting peace. And what's the wording behind that? What's the meaning behind those words? Well, a lasting peace is, of course, one that is backed up primarily by boots on the ground. British boots, French troops, and the British argue an American backstop. The Americans, for their part, have been ambiguous as terms of whether or not they commit to such a backstop. Some argue that the minerals deal, which was meant to be signed on Friday and yet still has not been, would guarantee a sense of backup for Ukraine, a sense of backstop if there are billions of American dollars working hard at extracting minerals in Ukraine, if there are American businessmen and employees in Ukraine. Would the Russians dare bomb one of those American-owned factories or indeed extraction plants? Highly unlikely. And would the Americans respond prodigiously were they to be attacked? Well, that is without doubt. So that's where the minerals deal seems to be so important. Even though it doesn't include this explicit security guarantee, could it provide for an implicit security guarantee? That is the hope of all sides. But of course, it can't just stop with a minerals deal. There is so much more to be discussed. And while this negotiation is still going on, it seems that European countries are almost negotiating amongst themselves before then they negotiate with Donald Trump, who then negotiates with Vladimir Putin and President Zelensky. We are at a stage of negotiation that is almost in a pre-negotiation. You can see negotiation to follow negotiation to follow negotiation. And while this is all going on, well, the war still rages. Perhaps that's why billions have now been committed by the British government to produce more missiles for Ukraine to be built in Northern Ireland, producing jobs there for the Northern Irish people, as well as missiles for Ukraine. But also an extra loan, over £2 billion to Ukraine to continue their war effort, because ultimately the British position is that when these negotiations begin, Ukraine needs to start them from a position of strength, not weakness, and that is how they will get the best deal. But what is the best deal? What does it look like in terms of territory? How much Ukrainian territory, if any, does Russia get to keep? And what is the operational independence of the rest of Ukraine that Russia does not sort of grab in this grubby peace deal? How sovereign would Ukraine actually be? To some extent, that is almost a more important discussion than the particulars of territory. Because if you sign a deal whereby Ukraine does not have sovereign control over its international agreements, for example, if almost uniquely as a country, as a terms of this deal, Ukraine was not able to freely enter into associations that it wished to. For example, if it wanted to join the European Union or if it wanted to join NATO, if it was prevented from making those requests, would it truly be a sovereign country? I'm not sure that anyone would really agree that it would be. So is it more important to look at what the rest of Ukraine, the part that won't be gobbled up by Russia can actually do? Can it operate like a normal, free and independent country? Or will it be bound by conditions in this peace deal? That is a huge question on the offing. And more than that, how much land that Russia took, that Russia ran illegal referendums in to proclaim independent People's Republic of Donetsk and Luhansk, and of course Crimea, which we shouldn't forget really started this war back in 2014. We talk about the 2022 invasion as if it started the war. In some respects, it didn't. That was simply the full-scale invasion. The war has been raging since the annexation in 2014 of Crimea, and fighting, of course, in the east of the country throughout the intervening time. There were deals that were signed by the Russians and Ukraine to try and stop this. There were the Minsk agreements, and yet Russia broke those terms. Russia continued to fight and then indeed launched their full-scale invasion. So that's where we are now. There isn't a great deal of clarity, and there isn't potentially a great deal of unanimity at this stage. The Lancaster House summit was the first in what we are told will be many summits for these leaders, although notably the United States is not a party to these. It's almost as if the Lancaster House group needs to negotiate with itself and then negotiate with Trump before the real negotiations then get on. But how much will Europe step up? Of course, there are only half a dozen European countries that actually meet the 2% NATO target for defence spending. That's, EU countries. The majority of EU countries do not meet that NATO minimum of 2% spending. Will we see many, many more countries spending a lot more on their armed forces, shouldering a lot more of the burden? Because if there are any tentative consensuses that are being drawn out after this meeting in Lancaster House in the heart of London, yards from Buckingham Palace, just this weekend, if there are any conclusions from that, one will surely be that more European countries need to shoulder more of the burden, to spend more on defence, not just up to 2%, but as the United Kingdom has committed, up to 2.5% and then 3%, perhaps even more. Could we see a new NATO minimum being recommended for these European countries that simply haven't been paying their way since the end of the Cold War? And finally, one note that I think is worth resting upon. The British ambassador to the United States, Lord Peter Mandelson, has been out and about on American television, trying to be this smooth-talking bridge between a British and American position. But has he been freewheeling too much? Because he has suggested something that has been later clarified to not be British policy. So is the British ambassador to the United States freewheeling or trying things out when he's talking to an American audience? He suggested that Ukraine could commit to a ceasefire first, almost to challenge Russia to then follow suit. Well, the Ministry of Defence has since said that is not British policy, but it does give a sense of all of the discussions that have been going on in these meetings, in these famous houses on both sides of the Atlantic. Well, there'll be so much more to discuss, no doubt, and of course, this is not the last in what will be a long line of summits. President Zelensky has been told by Donald Trump that he is welcome back in the White House when, quote, he is ready for peace. What could that look like? How could President Zelensky maintain his composure and indeed status and perhaps dignity, whilst also being perhaps toading towards Donald Trump? Is that what will need to happen to bring back these two sides together, to get that minerals agreement over the line and provide some sort of backstop that the French and British have been arguing for such a long time now? If there are to be British, French and other European troops on the ground in Ukraine to guarantee the peace, they don't want to do it without the sense that were Russia to go back for more, to reinvade Ukraine for a third time, well, they want a guarantee that there would be American intelligence, American air defence as well to back them up. None of that is of course yet agreed. But this is of course a developing situation, one that we're following closely here on GB News, so by now you know what to do. Click subscribe to stay up to date with all of these GBN updates as we develop and monitor this developing situation.